The stagecoach rattled to a halt before it even reached the outskirts of Redemption Creek, throwing Eleanor Morgan against the forward seat with such force that her bonnet was knocked askew. Rain drummed against the roof of the coach, the early autumn downpour having transformed the usually dusty trail into a river of mud that had finally proven impassable. The driver's voice called down through the deluge, barely audible over the howling wind that cut through the Wyoming territory like a knife. "End of the line, folks. Wheels broke clean through. We ain't making it to town proper tonight." Eleanor exchanged glances with the only other remaining passenger, an elderly man who had slept most of the journey from Cheyenne. His rheumy eyes reflected the same dismay she felt coursing through her veins. They were stranded, 3 miles short of their destination, as night approached and the storm intensified. The driver, a weather-beaten man named Simmons who had regaled them with tales of Indian attacks and bandit ambushes throughout their journey, swung down from his perch, water streaming from the brim of his hat. "Ain't nothing for it, ma'am," he said, opening the door and extending a calloused hand to help her down. "Town's that way. Might catch a ride if someone comes along, but with this weather." Eleanor gathered her skirts, mentally cataloging her possessions, one trunk containing everything she owned in the world, the last remnants of her life back east. At 32, she was neither young enough to be considered a blushing bride nor old enough to be dismissed as a spinster, but she knew how quickly that distinction could change out here on the frontier. "How far did you say it was to town?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear building in her chest. The last crimson rays of sunset were barely visible through the storm clouds, and darkness would soon envelop them completely. The driver shrugged, already working to unhitch the team of exhausted horses. 3 miles, give or take. Straight down this road. You'll see the lights once you crest that rise yonder." The elderly man had managed to extricate himself from the coach without assistance and was already trudging toward town, hunched against the driving rain, apparently unwilling to wait for his luggage or proper farewells. Eleanor squared her shoulders beneath her sodden traveling coat. 3 miles in mud and rain, at dusk, alone. It wasn't the arrival she had envisioned when she'd sold nearly everything she owned to purchase passage west, answering an advertisement seeking teachers for frontier communities. "Your trunk, ma'am?" Simmons called, as Eleanor took her first tentative steps along the muddy track. She turned back, the reality of her situation suddenly crystal clear. There was no possible way she could drag a heavy trunk 3 miles through this mire. "Is there no chance the coach will be repaired by morning?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Simmons spat a stream of tobacco juice that was immediately diluted by the rain. "Be lucky if I can get a wagon out here tomorrow afternoon, assuming this rain lets up. Best I can do is promise your things will be safe. Company's got a reputation to maintain." Eleanor nodded, resigned to her circumstances. The few precious items she had brought, her mother's silver hand mirror, the daguerreotype of her parents, the books that had been her companions through years of teaching in a Boston school for girls, would have to wait. More pressing was the need for shelter before complete darkness and the bone-deep chill that was already setting in despite the layers of her traveling costume. "Godspeed, ma'am," Simmons called after her, his voice nearly lost in a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground beneath her feet. By the time Eleanor crested the rise the driver had pointed out, night had fallen completely, and she was soaked to the skin. Her boots, practical enough for city streets but wholly inadequate for frontier conditions, were filled with water and mud that squelched with every painful step. Her fingers, clutching her small reticule containing what remained of her money, had gone numb with cold. But ahead, like a miracle emerging from the darkness, she saw the scattered lights of Redemption Creek. Not the bustling town she had imagined from the correspondence with the town council, but rather a single muddy street lined with rough wooden buildings, most dark at this hour. A flicker of lightning illuminated the scene more fully, a general store, what appeared to be a small church at the far end, and dominating the center of town, a 2-story structure with warm light spilling from its windows and the unmistakable sounds of piano music and raucous laughter emanating from within. The Silverado Saloon, its sign proclaimed in faded paint that was nonetheless visible even through the sheeting rain. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of town, shivering violently now as the wind cut through her wet garments. Propriety dictated that a lady, particularly one who had come west to assume the respected position of schoolteacher, should never set foot in an establishment like the Silverado. But propriety had never faced the prospect of a night spent in the open during a Wyoming thunderstorm. With no sign of a hotel or boarding house with its lamps still lit, Eleanor forced her aching legs to carry her toward the saloon. Just to inquire about proper lodgings, she told herself. Just to get directions and perhaps warm herself briefly before continuing to a more suitable establishment. The squelching of her boots was lost beneath a particularly energetic rendition of Camptown races as she mounted the 3 wooden steps to the saloon's covered porch. For a moment, she stood there, water streaming from her ruined bonnet and coat, gathering what remained of her courage as she faced the battered wooden doors that separated her from warmth, shelter, and the complete abandonment of her respectability. The wall of sound, heat, and the mingled smells of whiskey, tobacco, and unwashed bodies struck Eleanor like a physical force as she pushed open the batwing doors of the Silverado Saloon. The piano player, a thin man with a shock of white hair and a cigarette dangling from his lips, didn't miss a note, but the card players nearest the door paused their game to stare openly at the bedraggled woman who had just invaded their sanctuary. Eleanor felt her face flush despite the chill that still gripped her body, acutely aware of how she must appear, hair escaping its pins, hem caked with mud, the fine blue traveling dress that had been her one extravagance now clinging to her form in a most unseemly manner. A serving girl wearing a dress of scarlet satin cut daringly low bustled past with a tray of drinks, then did a double take at the sight of Eleanor standing frozen just inside the entrance. "You lost, lady?" she asked, her painted lips quirking into something between a smile and a smirk. Eleanor summoned what dignity she could. "I'm looking for the proprietor," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling that had overtaken her body. "The stagecoach broke down outside of town, and I require lodging for the night." "That'd be Mr. Sullivan," the girl said, nodding toward the far end of the long mahogany bar that dominated one wall of the establishment. "Man with the black vest." Eleanor followed her gaze to a broad-shouldered figure whose back was turned as he reached for a bottle on a high shelf. Even from behind, there was something commanding about the way he carried himself, not the soft roundness of the businessman she'd known in Boston, but the hard, lean strength of a man accustomed to physical labor and frontier hardships. As if sensing her scrutiny, he turned, and Eleanor found herself pinned by the most startlingly blue eyes she had ever encountered, set in a face that might have been handsome if not for the thin scar that ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth, pulling it into a permanent half-smile that didn't reach those piercing eyes. The saloon girl had already moved on, leaving Eleanor to make her way between the crowded tables toward the bar, painfully aware of the silence that had fallen over the nearest patrons and the trail of water she was leaving on the rough wooden floor. "Evening, ma'am," Sullivan said as she approached, his voice a deep rumble that somehow cut through the noise of the saloon without being raised. Up close, Eleanor could see that his black hair was streaked with silver at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of a man who had spent years squinting against the western sun. "You seem a mite out of place." There was no judgment in his tone, merely an observation of the obvious, and somehow that made it easier for Eleanor to straighten her spine and meet his gaze directly. "The stagecoach suffered a broken wheel 3 miles outside of town," she explained, fighting to keep her teeth from chattering. "The driver said repairs won't be possible until tomorrow at the earliest. I was told there might be lodging in town, but everything appears closed at this hour." Sullivan's eyes never left her face, though she was acutely aware that several of the men at nearby tables were showing considerably less restraint in their assessment of her sodden figure. "What brings you to Redemption Creek?" he asked, reaching beneath the bar and producing a clean towel, which he offered with a gesture that suggested refusing would be pointless. "I'm the new schoolteacher," Eleanor said, accepting the towel and blotting her face and neck, grateful for even this small comfort. "Eleanor Morgan. The town council is expecting me, though perhaps not quite so." She glanced down at her bedraggled appearance, dramatically. Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or recognition, but it was gone so quickly Eleanor thought she might have imagined it. "Tom Jenkins heads the council," Sullivan said. "Lives at the far end of town, but he and his wife will be abed by now. Most respectable folks are." There was the faintest emphasis on respectable that made Eleanor's cheeks warm again, though whether from embarrassment or indignation, she couldn't quite say. "Is there an inn?" she pressed, painfully aware of the water pooling around her ruined boots and the way her saturated clothing was beginning to chill her again now that the initial shock of warmth had faded. "Somewhere I might secure a room for the night?" Sullivan's scarred lip quirked upward in what might have been amusement. "Closest thing to a hotel in Redemption Creek is the rooms above this establishment, Miss Morgan. And I own them too." The implications of his statement hung in the air between them. Rooms above a saloon could mean only one thing in a frontier town, and Eleanor felt a fresh wave of heat rise to her face. "I see," she said stiffly, clutching her reticule more tightly. "Perhaps there is a respectable family who might take in a boarder for the night? I can pay." Sullivan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the polished bar top. "Folks around here turn in with the sun, Miss Morgan. And they tend to be cautious about opening their doors after dark. Too many bad experiences with claim jumpers and road agents." He straightened and gestured toward the window, where lightning briefly illuminated the intensifying downpour. "Besides, no one's answering their door in that. Not even for the new schoolmarm." Eleanor swallowed hard, the full weight of her predicament settling over her like a physical burden. She had less than $10 to her name until she received her first month's wages, her possessions were stranded miles outside of town, and she was standing in a saloon, dripping wet, with nowhere else to turn. Desperation has a way of clarifying one's options, she thought grimly. "What do you charge for a room, Mr. Sullivan?" she asked, her voice dropping to ensure their conversation remained as private as possible in the crowded saloon. Sullivan's eyes narrowed slightly, and he folded his arms across his broad chest. $5 a night," he said, naming a sum that both of them knew was extortionate for a frontier town. "That includes breakfast." Eleanor's heart sank. $5 would leave her with almost nothing to live on until her first payday, and there was no guarantee the stagecoach would be repaired by tomorrow. She might need 2 nights' lodging, or even 3. "That's rather steep," she ventured, hating the note of pleading that had crept into her voice. Sullivan shrugged, his expression impassive. "Supply and demand, Miss Morgan. My rooms are the only ones available, and from the look of you, shelter's in high demand at the moment." He wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. The chill had penetrated so deeply that Eleanor could feel it in her bones, and the persistent trembling was becoming harder to control. Soon it would be visible to everyone in the saloon, a display of weakness she couldn't afford in this room full of hard-eyed men who were watching the exchange with undisguised interest. With fingers stiff from cold, Eleanor opened her reticule and extracted her meager savings, $7.43, enough for a single night's lodging with little to spare. As she counted out the bills, her gaze fell upon the only other item of value she possessed, a small gold ring set with a modest pearl that had belonged to her grandmother. It was the last piece of jewelry she hadn't sold to finance her journey west, a talisman of the family she had lost to fever 5 years earlier. Swallowing the lump that rose in her throat, Eleanor slipped the ring from her finger and placed it on the bar beside the inadequate pile of bills. "Would this cover a second night, should I need it?" she asked quietly. Sullivan's eyes flickered to the ring, then back to her face, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Eleanor feared he would refuse. The ring wasn't valuable by any objective standard, the gold was thin, the pearl imperfect, but it was precious to her in ways that couldn't be measured. Finally, Sullivan reached out and pushed the ring back toward her with one finger. "I don't want your gold, Miss Morgan," he said, his voice dropping to a rumble that seemed to vibrate through her despite the noise of the saloon. "I want you." The color drained from Eleanor's face so rapidly that for a moment, she feared she might faint. The implication of his words struck her like a physical blow, and she took an instinctive step backward, her hand closing protectively around the ring. "Sir, I am not that kind of—" Sullivan's bark of laughter cut her off mid-sentence, drawing curious glances from the nearest patrons. "Your reputation's safe with me, schoolmarm," he said, amusement evident in his tone. "I need someone to serve drinks and keep the books, not warm my bed. My last girl quit without notice, and I'm short-handed." He nodded toward the red-dressed woman Eleanor had spoken to upon entering, who was now expertly balancing a tray of drinks while fending off the wandering hands of a minor. "Molly can't handle the crowd alone, especially on payday. You work for me until the end of the week, and I'll give you a room and meals. No charge." Eleanor blinked, relief and indignation warring within her. The relief won out, but only just. "You expect me to work as a barmaid? I'm a teacher, Mr. Sullivan. The town council would never." "The town council isn't here right now," Sullivan pointed out reasonably. "And they don't pay your salary until the end of the month. I'm offering you a warm, dry place to sleep and 3 square meals a day. All you have to do is serve drinks, add some figures, and keep your virtue intact for a few days." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Unless you'd prefer to continue on to the Jenkins place? It's only about a half-mile through the mud and rain. I'm sure Sarah Jenkins would be delighted to have her new boarder pounding on the door at this hour." The choice, when laid out so starkly, was no choice at all. Eleanor knew it, and Sullivan knew she knew it. Still, she hesitated, aware that accepting his offer might compromise her standing in the community before she had even properly arrived. A schoolteacher working in a saloon, even temporarily, would be the subject of gossip for months to come. But the alternative, continued exposure to the elements, possible illness, the humiliation of arriving at the Jenkins household in her current state, was equally unpalatable. Sullivan watched the internal struggle play out on her face with evident amusement, apparently confident of her eventual capitulation. "One week," Eleanor said finally, her voice barely audible over the renewed playing of the piano. "And no one can know of our arrangement. I'll claim to be staying with a friend." Sullivan's scarred lip quirked upward in that half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Deal," he said, extending a hand across the bar. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor took it, finding his grip warm and firm against her chilled fingers. "Finish out the night helping Molly. I'll show you to your room afterward." Without waiting for her response, he turned and pulled a clean apron from beneath the bar, tossing it to her with the casual expectation of a man accustomed to having his orders obeyed. "Better get that wet coat off first," he advised, already turning to serve a customer who had approached the bar. "And pin up your hair tighter. Saloon's no place for a woman looking like she just crawled out of a creek." Eleanor clutched the apron, momentarily speechless at his presumption, but the persistent shivering of her body reminded her that she had little choice but to comply. With as much dignity as she could muster, she removed her sodden coat and hung it on a peg near the door, then used Sullivan's towel to blot the worst of the moisture from her dress before tying the apron around her waist. Molly, the red-dressed barmaid, eyed Eleanor with frank curiosity as she approached, hands smoothing her damp hair back into its pins. "Boss said I'm to help you," Eleanor explained, finding it difficult to meet the other woman's gaze. Up close, Molly was younger than she had first appeared, perhaps no more than 20, with a worldly weariness in her heavily painted eyes that spoke of hard experience beyond her years. "That's a first," Molly said, her accent revealing hints of Irish ancestry. "Sullivan hiring a lady like you." There was no malice in her tone, merely surprise and perhaps a touch of amusement. "It's temporary," Eleanor said firmly, unwilling to elaborate further. "What would you like me to do?" Molly shrugged, shifting her tray to her hip in a practiced motion. "Fetch drinks from the bar to the tables. Don't let the hands wander. Call Sullivan if anyone gets too familiar. She nodded toward the bar where the saloon owner was pouring whiskey with mechanical efficiency. He don't tolerate his girls being manhandled, whatever else you might think of him. With that cryptic comment, she thrust a small tray into Eleanor's hands and pointed toward a table of minors whose glasses stood empty. Start there. They're good tippers if you smile pretty. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of activity that left Eleanor little time to contemplate the bizarre turn her life had taken. She fetched endless glasses of whiskey and beer, learned to navigate the crowded floor without spilling her tray, and developed a polite but firm response to the more forward comments directed her way. Her feet ached in her wet boots, and her dress had dried into an uncomfortable stiffness that restricted her movements, but the physical labor generated enough warmth to finally banish the bone-deep chill that had plagued her since the stagecoach had stopped. Sullivan watched her progress from behind the bar, his expression inscrutable, occasionally intervening with a sharp word when a patron's attention to Eleanor crossed the line from appreciation into something more dangerous. By midnight, the crowd had thinned considerably, and Eleanor's tray held nearly $3 in tips, small coins and even a few crumpled bills pressed into her hand with winks and slurred compliments that she pretended not to hear. Molly had proven to be an unexpectedly patient guide, showing Eleanor the most efficient routes between tables and warning her about customers with wandering hands or violent temperaments. Last call, gentlemen, Sullivan announced as the ancient clock behind the bar struck 12. His voice cutting through the haze of tobacco smoke and drunken conversation. Drink up or take it elsewhere. There was a chorus of good-natured grumbling, but Eleanor noted that no one seriously challenged the edict. Whatever else he might be, Jeremiah Sullivan clearly commanded respect in his establishment. Within half an hour, the saloon had emptied of all but a few die-hard drinkers, who Sullivan dispatched with increasing firmness until only the staff remained. Sullivan himself, the piano player, who Eleanor had learned was called Doc, though whether from any medical training or simply frontier humor was unclear, Molly, and herself. Not bad for your first night, schoolmarm, Sullivan said, counting the till with practiced efficiency as Eleanor collapsed onto a bar stool, her legs trembling with fatigue. Might make a proper barmaid of you yet. Eleanor was too exhausted to take offense, merely accepting the glass of water he slid across the bar with a nod of thanks. The cool liquid soothed her throat, parched from hours of shouting drink orders over the piano in general cacophony. I'll show you to your room, Sullivan said once he had locked the takings in a small safe beneath the bar. Molly, you're on breakfast duty tomorrow. 6 sharp. The younger woman nodded, already untying her apron and rolling her shoulders to release the tension of the long evening. Nice working with you, Miss Morgan, she said with a tired smile that transformed her face, briefly revealing the girl she must have been before life on the frontier had hardened her. Sleep well. Eleanor returned the smile, surprised to find she meant it. Despite the circumstances, there was something refreshingly direct about Molly that she found herself appreciating after years of navigating the layered social niceties of Boston society. Sullivan extinguished most of the lamps, leaving only a single light burning as he led Eleanor up a narrow staircase at the back of the saloon. The upper floor was surprisingly quiet after the chaos below, a long hallway with several doors leading off it, all closed. End of the hall, Sullivan said, producing a key from his vest pocket. Best room in the house. Private. Has its own washstand. He unlocked the door and stepped aside, allowing Eleanor to enter first. The room was small but scrupulously clean, containing a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a basin and pitcher, a battered dresser, and a single chair positioned near the window that overlooked the main street. A lamp burned low on the bedside table, casting warm shadows across the simple furnishings. It was nothing like the comfortable boarding house room Eleanor had anticipated when accepting the teaching position, but after the events of the evening, it seemed like unimaginable luxury. Privy's out back, Sullivan said from the doorway, seemingly reluctant to enter the room itself. Not much, but it's got a proper door with a lock, not just a hole in the ground like some places. There was an unexpected note of pride in his voice that caught Eleanor's attention. This rough man with his scarred face and imperious manner apparently cared about the comfort of his establishment, a realization that forced her to reconsider her initial impression of him. "Thank you, Mr. Sullivan," she said formally, too tired for further conversation. "This will be perfectly adequate." Sullivan nodded, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "We start serving breakfast at 6, he said, turning to leave. "Sleep as long as you need. Your shift doesn't start until noon tomorrow." Before she could respond, he was gone, closing the door firmly behind him. Eleanor stood motionless for a long moment, listening to his retreating footsteps, before the enormity of the day's events crashed over her like a wave. With hands that trembled now from exhaustion rather than cold, she removed her apron and the stiff, ruined dress, using the water in the pitcher to wash away the grime of travel and the stale smells of the saloon that clung to her skin. The simple cotton nightgown she extracted from her reticule, the only change of clothing she had thought to carry with her rather than pack in her trunk, felt like the height of luxury as she slipped it over her head. The bed, when she finally sank onto it, was surprisingly comfortable, the mattress firm but yielding, the quilt warm enough to banish the lingering chill from her bones. As she extinguished the lamp, plunging the room into darkness broken only by occasional flashes of lightning from the storm that still raged outside, Eleanor's last coherent thought was to wonder what strange twist of fate had delivered her, a Boston schoolteacher of impeccable reputation, into the employ of a saloon keeper in a Wyoming frontier town. Then exhaustion claimed her, and she knew no more until morning. The persistent patter of rain against the window roused Eleanor from a deep, dreamless sleep. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't recall where she was, the narrow bed, the unfamiliar ceiling, the sounds of movement from somewhere below, until the events of the previous night came rushing back with stark clarity. She sat up abruptly, wincing as her muscles protested the sudden movement after hours of unaccustomed labor. Weak sunlight filtered through the single window, suggesting it was well past dawn despite the continued rainfall. The battered clock on the dresser confirmed her suspicion, nearly 9 o'clock, hours later than she had risen in years. Alarmed at having slept so late, Eleanor swung her legs over the side of the bed, then paused as her gaze fell upon something that had not been there when she retired, a bundle of clothing laid neatly across the room's sole chair, topped with a folded piece of paper. With a mixture of curiosity and trepidation, she crossed to the chair and unfolded the note, written in a surprisingly elegant hand. "Miss Morgan, took the liberty of having some dry things sent over from the general store. Put it on your tab. J. Sullivan." The bundle contained a serviceable brown skirt, a cream-colored shirtwaist, and undergarments of modest but decent quality, nothing fancy, but clean, dry, and approximately her size. Beneath them were a pair of sturdy leather boots that looked far more suited to frontier conditions than her ruined city footwear. Eleanor stood for a long moment, staring at these unexpected provisions, unsure whether to feel grateful for Sullivan's foresight or indignant at the presumption of a man selecting women's clothing, including intimates. Practicality won out over propriety. Her own dress was still damp and hopelessly wrinkled, the boots likely ruined beyond repair. With efficiency born of necessity, she washed at the basin, dressed in the new garments, which fit better than she had any right to expect, and arranged her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. The boots were slightly large but comfortable with an extra pair of stockings, and Eleanor found herself appreciating their sturdy construction as she made her way downstairs, following the aroma of coffee and bacon that wafted up from below. The saloon was transformed in daylight, its tawdry glamour of the previous evening revealed as the shabby frontier establishment it truly was. The scarred tables and battered piano stood silent, awaiting the evening's entertainment, while morning light streaming through recently washed windows illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. A woman Eleanor hadn't seen before, older, with steel-gray hair pulled into a severe bun, was sweeping the floor with methodical strokes, pausing only briefly to assess Eleanor with shrewd eyes before resuming her task without comment. At the far end of the room, several tables had been pushed together to form a makeshift dining area, where Molly, looking younger and somehow more vulnerable without her makeup and revealing attire, was serving breakfast to a handful of men who appeared to be regular boarders. Of Sullivan there was no sign, though his presence seemed to linger in the orderly atmosphere that prevailed despite the disparate characters occupying the space. "There she is," Molly called cheerfully, spotting Eleanor at the foot of the stairs. "Thought you might sleep through to supper. Come and eat while it's hot." With all eyes turned toward her, Eleanor had little choice but to cross the room and take the empty seat Molly indicated at the end of the table. A plate heaped with eggs, bacon, and biscuits materialized before her, along with a steaming cup of coffee that smelled strong enough to stand a spoon in. "Gentlemen, this is Miss Morgan," Molly announced to the assembled diners. "She's helping out for a few days until her trunk arrives." The introduction was delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence that Eleanor could only nod in greeting, grateful for the discretion that omitted any mention of her true profession. The men, 3 grizzled individuals who might have been miners or farmhands, nodded in return before returning their attention to their meals with the single-minded focus of those accustomed to physical labor. "Sullivan's gone to check on your stagecoach," Molly informed her, topping off coffee cups with practiced efficiency. "Said to tell you he'd bring your trunk back if they've got the wheel fixed." Eleanor paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, surprised by this unexpected courtesy from a man who had essentially coerced her into working for him the night before. "That's very thoughtful of him," she managed, uncertain how to reconcile this consideration with her initial impression of Jeremiah Sullivan as an opportunistic businessman taking advantage of her misfortune. Molly's lips quirked in a knowing smile. "He ain't all bad," she said quietly, leaning closer under the pretext of refilling Eleanor's coffee cup. "Rough around the edges, sure, but fair in his way. Better than most men out here." Before Eleanor could respond to this cryptic assessment, the batwing doors swung open, admitting a gust of cool, damp air and the man himself, his broad shoulders filling the doorframe as he paused to remove his dripping hat. His gaze swept the room, coming to rest on Eleanor with an intensity that made her suddenly very conscious of the borrowed clothing she wore. "Miss Morgan," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "I see the dress fits well enough." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at this public reference to his intimate knowledge of her wardrobe, but she forced herself to respond with composure. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. Most considerate." He seemed to find something amusing in her formal tone, the scarred corner of his mouth lifting in that not-quite smile she was beginning to recognize. "Coach won't be repaired until tomorrow at the earliest," Sullivan announced, hanging his wet coat on a peg near the door. "Trails washed out in 2 places. Your trunk's safe, though. Driver's got it under canvas at the way station." He crossed to the table and accepted the cup of coffee Molly poured for him, drinking it black and scalding without so much as a wince. "Send word to Tom Jenkins that you've arrived safely and are staying with a friend until your things come in." Eleanor nearly choked on her biscuit at this news. "You spoke to Mr. Jenkins? What exactly did you tell him?" The panic in her voice was evident even to her own ears, and she saw Molly and the gray-haired cleaning woman exchange knowing glances. Sullivan regarded her calmly over the rim of his coffee cup. "Told him Miss Eleanor Morgan arrived on yesterday's stage but got caught in the storm. Said you were staying with Widow Hanson until your trunk arrives." He nodded toward the older woman with the broom, who offered Eleanor a thin smile that didn't reach her calculating eyes. "Martha here does my laundry and helps with rooms. Lives in a cabin behind the saloon. Far as Jenkins knows, that's where you'll be until tomorrow." The elaborate deception left Eleanor momentarily speechless. Sullivan had not only anticipated her concern about propriety but had constructed a plausible narrative to protect her reputation in a town where first impressions could determine one's standing for years to come. "I thank you," she said finally, uncertain how else to respond to this unexpected consideration. Sullivan shrugged, the movement emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders beneath the simple cotton shirt he wore. "Self-interest, Miss Morgan," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Town needs a schoolteacher more than it needs another scandal. Besides," he added with a glance at the clock, "you still owe me 6 more days of work." There it was again, that jarring shift from unexpected kindness to mercenary practicality that made Jeremiah Sullivan so difficult to categorize. Eleanor found herself wondering what experiences had shaped this complex man, even as she reminded herself that their association was temporary and based solely on mutual necessity. Speaking of which, Sullivan continued, setting down his empty cup, "We open at noon. Think you can handle the bookkeeping while Molly and I serve lunch?" The day passed more quickly than Eleanor had anticipated, the unfamiliar tasks of saloon work providing a distraction from her uncertain circumstances. Sullivan's ledgers proved to be meticulously maintained, requiring only simple entries and tallies that her teaching background made easy work of. The lunch crowd was sparse, a few townspeople who nodded politely to Eleanor but asked no awkward questions about her presence, perhaps warned off by Sullivan's forbidding expression whenever they glanced her way with too much curiosity. By mid-afternoon, when the rain finally ceased and watery sunlight began to dry the muddy street, Eleanor had settled into a rhythm of work that was not entirely unpleasant. Sullivan proved to be an exacting but fair employer, explaining tasks clearly and acknowledging work well done with the same gruff efficiency with which she pointed out errors. Molly, changing into her saloon attire as the afternoon wore on, regaled Eleanor with stories of Redemption Creek and its inhabitants that painted a vivid picture of frontier life while carefully avoiding any mention of Eleanor's true profession or the circumstances of her arrival. "That's Tom Jenkins coming across the street," Sullivan observed from his position behind the bar, where he was inventorying bottles for the evening rush. "Looks like your secret's out, schoolmarm." Eleanor's head jerked up from the ledger she had been balancing, alarm flooding through her at the sight of a portly, middle-aged man in a somber black suit picking his way carefully across the still muddy thoroughfare, heading directly for the saloon. Before she could panic or flee, Sullivan's hand closed firmly around her wrist, his voice dropping to a murmur meant for her ears alone. "Steady now. Follow my lead and remember, you're staying with Martha Hanson, not sleeping above my saloon." The casual intimacy of his touch and the warmth of his breath against her ear sent an unexpected shiver down Eleanor's spine, but there was no time to examine the sensation as the batwing doors swung open to admit the chairman of the town council and, effectively, her employer. "Mr. Sullivan," Jenkins called, removing his hat as he entered the establishment with visible reluctance. "And this must be our new schoolteacher. Miss Morgan, I presume?" The next hour was an exercise in careful deception that left Eleanor marveling at Sullivan's ability to construct believable falsehoods on the fly. According to the narrative he spun for Jenkins, Eleanor had indeed arrived on yesterday's stagecoach only to be stranded by the storm. The kindly widow Hanson, who appeared on cue to corroborate the story, had offered shelter, and Eleanor was merely visiting the saloon to inquire about the status of her trunk and to thank Mr. Sullivan for checking on the stagecoach repairs. If Jenkins found it odd that the schoolteacher was seated at a table with the saloon's account books, he gave no sign, instead expressing appropriate concern for her comfort and assuring her that the schoolhouse and attached living quarters would be ready for her inspection tomorrow. "We're mighty pleased to have a teacher of your caliber joining our community, Miss Morgan," Jenkins said, his manner pompous but sincere. "The children of Redemption Creek deserve a proper education, and your references from Boston speak highly of your abilities." Eleanor murmured appropriate thanks, acutely aware of Sullivan's sardonic gaze and Molly's barely suppressed amusement as she played the role of refined Boston schoolmarm while standing in the middle of a frontier saloon. "I've taken the liberty of having your things sent to Martha's place," Sullivan interjected smoothly when Jenkins began to suggest that Eleanor might prefer to stay with his family until her trunk arrived. "No sense in disrupting your household, Tom, when the widow's already made arrangements." There was something in his tone, a subtle note of challenge beneath the surface courtesy, that made Jenkins hesitate before nodding his agreement. "Very thoughtful, Jeremiah. Well then, Miss Morgan, I'll call for you tomorrow morning to show you the schoolhouse. Say 9 o'clock? With the plan settled and propriety ostensibly maintained, Jenkins took his leave, casting one curious backward glance at the tableau formed by Eleanor, Sullivan, and the supposed widow before stepping back into the afternoon sunlight. "That man's never set foot in my establishment in daylight hours before," Sullivan observed dryly once the doors had swung shut behind the council chairman. Must be powerful curious about our new schoolmarm to overcome his public stance on the evils of strong drink. Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, tension draining from her body now that the immediate threat to her reputation had passed. He seemed perfectly respectable, she said, though without much conviction. Something in Jenkins' manner, perhaps the too eager way his gaze had assessed her, or the slight condescension in his tone, had struck a discordant note. Sullivan's short bark of laughter held little humor. Jenkins is respectable the way fool's gold is valuable, all shine and no substance. Keeps his dealings with my establishment limited to after-hours and backroom poker games where no one can see him losing money he can't afford to part with. The casual revelation of the council chairman's hypocrisy was delivered without malice, merely as a statement of fact, yet it forced Eleanor to reconsider her assumptions about the social order of Redemption Creek. In Boston, such behavior from a man of Jenkins' standing would be cause for scandal. Here, it seemed to be accepted with a shrug as the natural order of things. You should eat something before the evening crowd arrives, Sullivan continued, changing the subject with the abruptness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Martha makes a decent stew. I'll have her bring you a bowl while you finish those figures. The evening rush at the Silverado proved even busier than the previous night, the improved weather bringing customers from outlying homesteads and mining claims who had been kept away by the storm. Eleanor found herself pressed into service beyond the account books, delivering drinks alongside Molly when the crowd grew too large for one barmaid to manage. If any of the patrons recognized her as the bedraggled woman from the night before, or had heard rumors of Redemption Creek's new schoolteacher, they gave no sign, treating her with the same mixture of rough courtesy and barely restrained appreciation they showed to Molly. Sullivan watched over both women from his position behind the bar, his gaze constantly sweeping the room for signs of trouble, occasionally stepping in with a quiet word or meaningful look when a customer's behavior threatened to cross the line from boisterous to dangerous. By midnight, when the last stragglers had been ushered out and the doors locked for the night, Eleanor's feet ached and her throat was raw from shouting drink orders over the piano in general din, but she felt an unexpected sense of accomplishment at having survived another night in an environment so far removed from her previous existence. You're a quick study, schoolmarm, Sullivan observed as she counted out her tips at the bar, nearly $5 tonight, more than she would make in a day of teaching. Might have missed your calling. The teasing note in his voice was new, a softening of his usual gruff manner that caught Eleanor off guard. In the dim light of the single lamp left burning, with his shirt sleeves rolled up and his dark hair slightly mussed, he looked less like the intimidating saloon owner who had bargained for her services and more like a man who had worked honestly for his living and earned his rest. I think I'll stick to molding young minds rather than serving whiskey, she replied with a small smile of her own, too tired to maintain the formal distance she had tried to establish between them. Though I admit, the tips are better in your line of work. Sullivan's laugh, a genuine sound this time, not the sardonic chuckle she had heard before, transformed his face, softening the hard lines and making the scars seem less a mark of violence and more a character in a story yet to be told. For a brief moment, Eleanor glimpsed the man he might have been before whatever experiences had hardened him to frontier life, and she found herself curious about that story in a way that went beyond mere politeness. Get some sleep, Sullivan said, breaking the moment as he extinguished the last lamp. Jenkins will be here bright and early to show you your new kingdom. Wouldn't do to have the schoolmarm yawning in his face. The return to formality in his tone reminded Eleanor of the reality of their situation. She was still essentially his employee, working off a debt of necessity, and tomorrow would begin her real life in Redemption Creek, away from the Silverado and its enigmatic owner. Good night, Mr. Sullivan, she said quietly, turning toward the stairs that led to her temporary lodging. And thank you for your assistance today with Mr. Jenkins. Sullivan nodded, his expression once again unreadable in the darkness. Just business, Miss Morgan, he replied, though something in his tone suggested the words weren't entirely truthful. Just business. As Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room, she found herself wondering what Jeremiah Sullivan might consider personal rather than business, and why the question seemed suddenly important to her after less than 2 days in his company. The following morning dawned clear and cool, the storm having blown itself out overnight, leaving behind a washed-clean sky of startling blue and puddles that reflected sunlight like scattered mirrors along the main street. Eleanor woke early, determined to be ready for Jenkins' arrival and the beginning of her official duties in Redemption Creek. Her trunk had still not arrived. Sullivan had reported the previous evening that repairs to the stagecoach were proceeding but not yet complete, so she donned the borrowed clothing again, taking extra care with her appearance despite the limited resources at her disposal. The simple breakfast served in the empty saloon was a quiet affair, with Sullivan absent on some errand and only Molly and Martha for company. "You'll do fine," Molly assured her, seeming to sense Eleanor's nervousness about the coming inspection of the schoolhouse. "Jenkins talks big, but he needs you more than you need him. Town's been without a teacher for 6 months, and folks are getting restless about their kids running wild." Martha, taciturn as ever, merely nodded her agreement, though her sharp eyes missed nothing as she assessed Eleanor's appearance with professional detachment. "Dress needs pressing," she observed, the first direct comment she had made to Eleanor since their introduction. "But you'll pass muster. Got a proper teacherly look about you." Jenkins arrived promptly at 9, his portly figure attired in the same somber suit, his manner officially cordial as he escorted Eleanor from the saloon, or more precisely, from its entrance, as he seemed reluctant to set foot inside again in daylight. The schoolhouse stood at the far end of the main street, a modest structure of weathered boards with a small bell tower and attached living quarters that would serve as Eleanor's home for the duration of her contract. The interior was simple but adequate, a single large room with rows of rough-hewn desks facing a teacher's desk and blackboard, shelves along one wall holding a modest collection of books and supplies, and windows that allowed ample light but rattled in their frames when the wind blew. The living quarters proved equally basic, a bedroom barely large enough for a narrow bed and chest of drawers, a small sitting room with a cast-iron stove for heat and cooking, and a pantry stocked with essential supplies to tide her over until she could make proper arrangements. It was far from the comfortable accommodations she had enjoyed in Boston, but Eleanor found herself appreciating the simple functionality of the space and the independence it would afford her after years of boarding-house living with its attendant rules and scrutiny. "School term starts Monday next," Jenkins informed her as they completed the tour. "We've got 27 pupils enrolled, ages 6 to 16. Some of the older boys only come when farm work permits, mind you, but we expect regular attendance from the younger children." He hesitated, tugging at his collar in apparent discomfort. "There's the matter of your first month's advance. Normally, we'd have it ready upon your arrival, but with the bank in Clayton temporarily closed due to some irregularities in their accounts." He trailed off, clearly embarrassed by the admission that her promised salary might not be forthcoming as expected. Eleanor felt a sinking sensation in the pit of her stomach. Her arrangement with Sullivan was predicated on working until her trunk arrived, but without the advance she had counted on, her financial situation would be precarious at best. "When do you expect the bank to reopen?" she asked, working to keep her voice steady and professional despite the anxiety building within her. Jenkins shrugged, his expression evasive. "Week or two, most like. Meanwhile, we've arranged credit for you at the general store for necessities. Hanson's boy will bring your trunk up from the saloon once it arrives." By noon, Eleanor found herself alone in the schoolhouse, Jenkins having departed with promises to send the school roster and curriculum guidelines later that day. The silence after his departure was profound, broken only by the occasional creak of the buildings settling in the midday sun and distant sounds from the main street. For the first time since her arrival in Redemption Creek, Eleanor had the luxury of solitude and time to contemplate her situation. The teaching position was real enough, the schoolhouse adequate if Spartan, and the community seemingly accepting of her presence. Yet the delayed salary presented a practical problem she had not anticipated, and the prospect of establishing herself in a frontier town with virtually no resources was daunting. More unsettling was the realization that, despite having achieved her goal of reaching Redemption Creek and securing her position, her thoughts kept returning to the Silverado Saloon and its enigmatic owner. Jeremiah Sullivan had been alternately mercenary and kind, demanding and protective, his motives as difficult to discern as the story behind the scar that marked his face. Eleanor had known him for barely 2 days, yet somehow the thought of simply walking away from their unusual arrangement left her with a sense of unfinished business that she couldn't quite explain even to herself. The knock at the schoolhouse door startled Eleanor from her reverie. She opened it to find Sullivan himself standing on the small porch, her trunk at his feet and an unreadable expression on his face. "Delivery," he said simply, lifting the heavy container as if it weighed nothing and carrying it inside without waiting for an invitation. Eleanor stepped back, momentarily flustered by his unexpected appearance and the casual display of strength. "I thought Mr. Hanson was to bring it," she managed, watching as Sullivan set the trunk down at the foot of the bed in her new quarters. He straightened, brushing dust from his hands, his gaze taking in the modest room with a quick, assessing sweep. "Hanson's boy threw his back out loading hay this morning," he said. "Besides, wanted to see where Jenkins was putting you." There was something in his tone, concern, perhaps, or simple curiosity, that caught Eleanor's attention. "It's perfectly adequate," she said, gesturing to encompass the small living space. "Basic but clean. I'm sure I'll be quite comfortable once I'm properly settled." Sullivan's expression suggested he had his doubts, but he merely nodded, his gaze lingering on the narrow bed with its thin mattress and single blanket. "Jenkins mention when you be getting your advance?" he asked, the question seemingly casual though his eyes were sharp as they returned to her face. Eleanor hesitated, uncertain how much of her financial predicament to reveal to a man who was, despite their brief association, essentially a stranger. Sullivan's raised eyebrow indicated he had read her hesitation correctly. "Bank trouble," he supplied, not waiting for her response. "Clayton's been shut down for 3 weeks already." "Jenkins feeding you that temporary closure line?" Surprised by his accurate assessment, Eleanor nodded, sinking onto the room's sole chair as the implications of a longer delay became clear. "He didn't say it would be that long," she admitted. "Just a week or 2. He's arranged credit at the general store, but..." Sullivan's short, humorless laugh cut her off. "Store credit under Jenkins' guarantee won't buy you more than bare necessities, and Michaels charges double interest if you don't settle up by month's end." He crossed his arms, leaning against the doorframe in a deceptively casual pose that nonetheless filled the small space with his presence. "What's your plan, schoolmarm? Can't run a classroom on empty pockets and store credit." The blunt question caught Eleanor off guard, though she recognized its legitimacy. Her savings were virtually depleted, her only valuable possession the grandmother's ring she still wore, and her salary now uncertain for weeks to come. The prospect of beginning her tenure in Redemption Creek in debt to the general store, unable to properly establish herself or prepare for her students, was deeply troubling. "I suppose I'll manage somehow," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I've faced challenges before." Sullivan regarded her steadily, his blue eyes missing nothing of her discomfort or the brave front she attempted to maintain. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Eleanor found herself holding her breath, waiting for a verdict she hadn't realized she was seeking. Finally, he straightened from his relaxed posture, decision apparently reached. "Offer still stands," he said, his voice matter-of-fact rather than triumphant. "Work evenings at the Silverado until the bank situation resolves. Room and board included. Cash tips are yours to keep." He held up a hand as Eleanor opened her mouth to protest. "Before you get on your high horse about propriety, you'd be living here, teaching days, working nights. Nobody needs to know our arrangement except those already in on it." The proposition hung in the air between them, tempting in its practicality yet fraught with potential complications. Eleanor's mind raced through the alternatives, finding them all wanting in comparison to Sullivan's straightforward offer. What would people think if the new schoolteacher was seen working in a saloon, she asked, giving voice to her primary concern.
Sullivan's scarred lip quirked upward in that now familiar half-smile. "Folks around here are practical, Miss Morgan.
Half the women in town took jobs they wouldn't write home about when they first arrived. Long as you teach their children properly during the day, most won't care how you put food on your table at night." He paused, his expression growing more serious. "Those that would judge you are the same hypocrites who drink at my bar after dark and preach temperance on Sunday mornings.
Their good opinion ain't worth starving for."
There was a bitter truth in his assessment that resonated with Eleanor's own observations of Jenkins and the social structure of Redemption Creek. Still, years of conditioning about a woman's reputation and the particular expectations placed on teachers made her hesitate. "I would need to be discreet," she said slowly, not quite committing but no longer outright rejecting the idea.
"My contract likely has a morality clause." "Discretion's my specialty," Sullivan replied, and for the first time, Eleanor detected a note of genuine amusement in his voice. "Nobody who matters will know, and those who already know won't tell." He straightened from the doorframe, apparently considering the matter settled. "I'll expect you at the Silverado by 6. Molly will show you the back entrance." Without waiting for her final agreement, he turned to leave, pausing only at the outer door of the schoolhouse. "One more thing," he added, glancing back at Eleanor who had followed him into the main room. "Jenkins is having a welcome dinner for you tomorrow night at his home. Introducing you to the right sort of Redemption Creek society." The hint of mockery in his tone made it clear what he thought of such distinctions. "Might want to wear something nice. First impressions and all that." With a tip of his hat that managed to be both respectful and faintly sardonic, he was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in the empty schoolhouse with the distinct feeling that she had just agreed to far more than temporary employment at the Silverado Saloon. The remainder of the day passed in a flurry of activity as Eleanor unpacked her trunk, arranged her meager possessions in the small living quarters, and began preparing for the start of classes the following week. Jenkins' promised curriculum materials arrived mid-afternoon, delivered by a solemn-faced boy who introduced himself as the council chairman's son, Robert. The boy lingered, openly curious about the new teacher, answering Eleanor's questions about the town and school with increasing animation until his father's voice called from the street, summoning him home with a sharpness that made the child's shoulders slump before he hurried away. Left alone again, Eleanor reviewed the roster of students and the rudimentary curriculum outline, mentally cataloging the adjustments she would need to make based on her experience in more structured Boston classrooms. The work provided a welcome distraction from thoughts of her arrangement with Sullivan and the complicated position she now found herself in: schoolteacher by day, saloon worker by night, straddling two worlds that frontier society kept carefully separated. As the afternoon waned, Eleanor faced the practical decision she had been avoiding, whether to honor the tacit agreement she had reached with Sullivan. The financial logic was undeniable: without the salary advance, she had insufficient resources to establish herself properly, and the prospect of accumulating debt at the general store was unappealing at best. Yet accepting Sullivan's offer meant embracing a duality that could threaten her position and reputation if discovered. As she changed from the borrowed brown skirt and shirtwaist into the one decent dress she had packed in her trunk, a navy blue merino wool that had seen better days but would have to suffice until she could afford better, Eleanor found her thoughts returning to Sullivan himself. There was more to the saloon owner than his gruff exterior and mercenary practicality suggested, glimpses of complexity that intrigued her despite her best efforts to maintain professional distance. His concern about her accommodations, his insights into the town's social hierarchy, the unexpected consideration he had shown for her reputation, all hinted at a man whose story was far from simple, and Eleanor found herself curious about that story in a way that went beyond mere gratitude for his assistance. At precisely 6 o'clock, Eleanor slipped out the back door of the schoolhouse, following the narrow alley that ran behind the main street buildings as Sullivan had instructed. The evening was mild, the aftermath of the storm having left the air clean and crisp with the promise of approaching autumn. Few people were about at this hour, most respectable businesses closing up shop while the saloons and dining establishments were just beginning their evening operations.
Eleanor kept her head down nonetheless, a shawl pulled over her hair providing minimal disguise as she made her way to the rear entrance of the Silverado. Molly was waiting as promised, ushering her inside with a conspirator's smile and a quick glance to ensure they hadn't been observed. Right on time, the younger woman approved, leading Eleanor through the back hallway to the main saloon, where Sullivan was arranging glasses behind the bar in preparation for the evening crowd. He looked up at their entrance, his expression revealing nothing beyond a brief nod of acknowledgement. "Got a new dress for Jenkins' dinner tomorrow," Molly announced cheerfully, apparently feeling no need to confirm Eleanor's decision to accept their arrangement.
"Martha's pressing it now."
"Nothing fancy, but respectable enough for dinner with the town council and their wives." "That wasn't necessary," Eleanor began, uncomfortable with the implication that she needed charity beyond the agreed-upon room and board, but Sullivan cut her off with a gesture. "Consider it an investment in your success, Miss Morgan," he said, his tone making it clear the matter was not open for discussion. "Redemption Creek needs a teacher who's respected by the right people."
"That means looking the part." There was an underlying current to his words that suggested personal experience with the town's judgments, though Eleanor could only guess at its nature.
Before she could pursue the thought, the front doors swung open to admit the first customers of the evening, and Sullivan nodded toward the account books laid ready on a small table in the corner.
"Same as yesterday," he instructed.
"Figures first, then help Molly when it gets busy." The familiar directive, delivered without fanfare or commentary on the unusual nature of their arrangement, somehow made the situation seem more manageable. Eleanor took her place at the table, opened the ledger to the day's page, and began the task of reconciling the previous night's earnings, consciously setting aside questions about Sullivan's motives and her own complicated response to them for a time when she had the luxury of reflection. The evening passed in a blur of activity as the Silverado filled with its regular clientele, miners, ranchers, and townsmen seeking respite from the day's labor in whiskey and cards. Eleanor moved between her bookkeeping duties and serving drinks with increasing confidence, finding the routine almost soothing in its predictability after days of upheaval and uncertainty. Sullivan managed the bar with the same efficient authority she had observed before, his gaze periodically tracking her progress through the crowded room with an attentiveness that might have been merely professional oversight but felt somehow more personal. By midnight, when the last stragglers had been ushered out and the doors locked for the night, Eleanor was tired but satisfied, her apron pocket heavy with the evening's tips and her mind occupied with practical plans for establishing her classroom rather than doubts about her unorthodox employment arrangement. "You're getting good at this," Sullivan observed as she counted out her earnings at the bar, nearly $7, a sum that would go far towards supplementing the meager credit Jenkins had arranged at the general store.
"Folks are asking for you by name already." The unexpected compliment brought a flush of pleasure that Eleanor tried to dismiss as simple satisfaction in a job well done.
"I doubt my students would appreciate knowing their teacher is developing a reputation as an efficient barmaid," she replied lightly, securing the money in her reticule. Sullivan's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, amusement, perhaps, or approval of her pragmatism. "Your students will appreciate having a teacher who can support herself without depending on Jenkins' goodwill or the town's charity," he countered.
"Independence counts for something out here, even for schoolmarms."
There was that word again, independence, voiced with a respect that suggested Sullivan valued the quality highly, perhaps had fought for it himself in ways Eleanor could only imagine. "Speaking of Jenkins," Sullivan continued, his tone shifting to something more businesslike, "Martha will bring the dress by the schoolhouse tomorrow morning.
Dinner's at 7. You know the house?"
Eleanor nodded. Jenkins' home was one of the larger structures in town, situated on a small rise at the north end of the main street, its white-painted exterior and picket fence a clear statement of the owner's aspirations to Eastern respectability. "I know it," she confirmed, suddenly conscious of the weariness that had settled into her bones after the long day. Sullivan seemed to notice, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Get some sleep," he said, the gruff concern in his voice warming Eleanor in ways the physical exertion of the evening had not.
Jenkins' wife is a notorious gossip. You'll need your wits about you tomorrow night.
The warning was delivered without malice, merely a practical assessment of the social challenge that lay ahead. Eleanor nodded, gathering her shawl around her shoulders in preparation for the walk back to the schoolhouse. Sullivan hesitated, then reached beneath the bar and produced a small revolver, which he placed on the counter between them. For the walk home, he said in response to Eleanor's startled expression. Town's mostly peaceful, but a woman alone after dark. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Before Eleanor could protest that she had no experience with firearms and no desire to acquire any, Sullivan continued, "It's loaded, safety's on. Just showing it is usually enough to discourage unwanted company. I'll teach you to use it properly when you have time." The casual offer of protection and instruction, delivered without fuss or expectation of gratitude, struck Eleanor with unexpected force. In Boston, her safety had been taken for granted, a product of structured society and the careful limitations placed on a respectable woman's movements. Here on the frontier, where such structures were still in formation, Sullivan's practical concern acknowledged both the dangers she might face and her right to defend against them, a respect for her agency that many of her more civilized acquaintances would have found shocking. "Thank you," she said simply, accepting the weapon with more confidence than she felt and carefully tucking it into her reticule. Sullivan nodded, seemingly satisfied, and moved to extinguish the lamps as Eleanor made her way to the back door. The night air was cool against her face as she stepped into the alley, the weight of the revolver in her bag a tangible reminder of frontier realities and of the complex man who had recognized her vulnerability without diminishing her independence. It was, Eleanor reflected as she walked briskly toward the schoolhouse, a remarkably considerate gesture from a man who claimed to be motivated solely by business interests. The dress Martha delivered the following morning was a revelation, not an extravagant garment by Eastern standards, but far superior to anything Eleanor had brought with her from Boston. Made of deep green wool with subtle black braiding at the collar and cuffs, it was both fashionable enough for a dinner with the town's leading citizens and practical enough for frontier conditions. Martha's accompanying instructions were characteristically terse: hair up, clean gloves, no jewelry except that ring of yours. Jenkins' wife notices everything and talks about it twice as much. The older woman departed as abruptly as she had arrived, leaving Eleanor to wonder at the network of knowledge and assessment that seemed to connect the disparate elements of Redemption Creek society. Sullivan clearly understood this network intimately, his provision of the appropriate dress evidence of his awareness of the social codes that operated beneath the surface of frontier life. As she prepared for her day of classroom organization, Eleanor found herself increasingly curious about how a saloon owner had acquired such insight into the expectations of respectable society, and why he seemed invested in ensuring she met those expectations despite their unconventional arrangement. Jenkins' dinner party proved to be exactly as Sullivan had predicted, a carefully orchestrated introduction to the self-appointed social leaders of Redemption Creek, hosted by a woman whose keen-eyed assessment of Eleanor's appearance, background, and demeanor was barely disguised beneath effusive welcomes and solicitous inquiries about her comfort. The other guests included the town doctor and his wife, the owner of the general store and his spinster sister, and the circuit-riding minister who happened to be in town for his monthly visit. Eleanor navigated the social currents with the skill acquired through years of teaching in Boston, where parental expectations and school board politics had required similar diplomacy. She deflected questions about her accommodations with vague references to the hospitality of a friend until she was properly settled, expressed appropriate enthusiasm for the challenge of educating the town's children, and maintained a careful balance between demonstrating her qualifications and avoiding any hint of Eastern superiority that might alienate her hosts. Throughout the evening, she was conscious of the double life she had begun to construct, the respectable schoolteacher dining with Redemption Creek's elite while her other identity as a saloon worker remained carefully concealed, a secret shared only with Sullivan, Molly, and the taciturn Martha. "We're so pleased to have a teacher of your caliber in our community, Miss Morgan," Mrs. Jenkins gushed as the evening drew to a close, her piercing gaze belying the warmth of her words. "Such a journey for a lady alone.
We must hear all about your adventures getting here another time.
The gentle probe for information about Eleanor's arrival and first days in town was deftly delivered, and Eleanor recognized the danger it represented. Sullivan had warned her that Mrs. Jenkins' gossip network was extensive. Any slip regarding her temporary employment at the Silverado would spread through the community within hours. "Perhaps when I'm fully settled," Eleanor replied with a polite smile, accepting her shawl from Robert, who had been pressed into service as a reluctant footman for the evening. "The journey west is still rather a blur of dust and discomfort, I'm afraid." The deflection seemed to satisfy Mrs. Jenkins for the moment, though the speculative gleam in her eye suggested the subject would be revisited. As Eleanor made her goodbyes and stepped out into the cool evening air, she found herself unexpectedly anticipating the comparative honesty of the Silverado, where pretense was minimal and Sullivan's straightforward expectations were refreshingly clear after an evening of social navigation. The rhythm of Eleanor's days quickly established itself as the week progressed, mornings and afternoons devoted to preparing the schoolhouse for the start of classes, evenings spent at the Silverado maintaining Sullivan's accounts and helping Molly serve drinks during busy periods. The dual existence proved less difficult to maintain than she had initially feared, partly due to Sullivan's careful management of her comings and goings through the saloon's rear entrance, and partly because the town's social divisions meant those who frequented the Silverado at night were unlikely to have occasion to discuss the new schoolteacher in circles where such knowledge might damage her reputation. Eleanor found herself adapting to frontier life with surprising ease, the practical challenges of her situation leaving little time for homesickness or regret over the comfortable but constrained existence she had left behind in Boston. The tips she earned at the saloon, combined with Sullivan's provision of meals, allowed her to supplement the meager supplies in the schoolhouse and prepare properly for her students without incurring debt at the general store, a financial independence that provided significant peace of mind as the start of classes approached. More unexpected was the growing complexity of her relationship with Jeremiah Sullivan. What had begun as a pragmatic arrangement born of necessity had evolved into something less easily defined, marked by small kindnesses and moments of connection that belied the saloon owner's gruff exterior. He insisted on escorting her home each night after closing, his tall figure a silent, protective presence in the darkness despite Eleanor's protests that she was perfectly capable of making the short walk alone. He procured books for her classroom that hadn't been on Jenkins' approved list but which Sullivan deemed essential for a proper education, delivering them without fanfare or explanation of how he had obtained volumes that weren't stocked at the general store. When Eleanor mentioned in passing that the schoolhouse stove smoked badly when the wind was from the east, she arrived the next morning to find Sullivan and a taciturn man introduced only as Charlie repairing the chimney, the work completed with efficient skill before the first students were due to arrive. Each gesture was presented as a matter of business or practical necessity, yet the accumulation of such actions suggested an interest in her welfare that went beyond their financial arrangement. The day before classes were scheduled to begin, Eleanor worked late at the schoolhouse, finalizing lesson plans and arranging the room for the arrival of her students. Dusk had fallen by the time she finished, the lengthening shadows a reminder that she had missed her usual hour for reporting to the Silverado. As she hurriedly gathered her materials, the schoolhouse door opened without warning, admitting Sullivan himself, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the classroom with its neatly arranged desks and freshly cleaned blackboard. "Thought you might have forgotten our arrangement," he said, though his tone held no accusation. Molly was getting worried. The implication that Sullivan's own concern had prompted his visit rather than Molly's went unspoken, but Eleanor found herself warming to the thought nonetheless. "I lost track of time," she admitted, gesturing to the classroom. "There's so much to prepare before tomorrow." Sullivan nodded, his gaze taking in the careful organization of books and slates, the hand-drawn maps Eleanor had created to supplement the limited teaching materials provided by the town council, the small touches that transformed the bare room into a place of learning. "You've done good work here," he said after a moment, the simple approval in his voice more gratifying than Mrs. Jenkins' effusive but calculated praise had been. "Kids are lucky to have you." Eleanor felt a flush of pleasure at the unexpected compliment, quickly followed by an awareness of how much Sullivan's good opinion had come to matter to her in the short time they had known each other. "Thank you," she said, unnecessarily straightening a stack of readers to hide her momentary confusion. "I hope the students agree tomorrow." Sullivan's scarred lip quirked in that half-smile she had come to find oddly endearing. "They will," he said with quiet confidence. "Word's already spread that the new teacher knows her business and won't tolerate foolishness. Jenkins' boy has been talking you up since that first day you met him." This news was both surprising and heartening. Eleanor had spent less than an hour with young Robert Jenkins, yet apparently had made enough of an impression for the boy to become an advocate among his peers. She wondered briefly what other information circulated about her in the children's conversations, and whether any rumors of her evening employment had reached their ears. "No one knows about the Silverado," Sullivan said, seeming to read her thoughts with uncanny accuracy. "Martha and Molly don't talk, and my regular customers know better than to gossip about what happens in my place." The reassurance should have been comforting, yet Eleanor found herself troubled by the continued necessity for secrecy. The duality of her existence in Redemption Creek had served its practical purpose, providing financial stability while she established herself professionally, but the approaching start of classes marked a natural transition point. With her teaching duties officially beginning, the demands on her time and energy would increase significantly, making her evening work at the saloon more challenging to maintain. More troubling was the growing awareness that her attachment to the Silverado, and to Sullivan himself, had become more personal than professional, a complication she hadn't anticipated when accepting his initial offer. "Perhaps it's time we discussed ending our arrangement," she suggested carefully, watching Sullivan's face for his reaction. "With classes starting tomorrow, my responsibilities to the school must take precedence." Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes, disappointment, perhaps, or a more complex emotion she couldn't quite identify, before his expression settled into neutral acceptance. "Makes sense," he agreed, his tone deliberately casual. "You've earned enough to tide you."